Previously, we took a look at the setup for the Wars of Succession, or the Wars of the Diadochi, following the death of Alexander. This time, we're going to look a bit more in depth at the first and second wars. There was 4 in total, spanning almost 50 years, and this was one of the most tumultuous times in ancient Greek or Hellenistic age, and would be until the rise of the Romans and their own Punic Wars. But first, let's take a little closer look at how the stage broke down immediately after Alexander's death. So, there were 2 main competitors for the title of Emperor of Alexander's Empire. That would be Aridaeus, who came to be Philip III, which was Alexander's brother. He was Macedonian in blood and lineage, however, he was not mentally all there, and he surely would have been manipulated by counselors and by anyone who had the strength to do so. The other successor would have been the son of Alexander, Alexander IV. Unfortunately, he was an infant about 4 or 5 months or so after Alexander's death, and it would take a very long time for him to ever actually ascend to the throne. This was the choice by Perdiccas, the strongest and the most capable of leading. He had been the Chiliarch, or the second in command, to Alexander during his campaigns, and he also was the holder of the largest of the 3 parts of Alexander's empire, that of Asia. In Babylon, he had Alexander's body. He also had Aridaeus and Roxanne and her son, Philip IV. So he stood to gain the most from just about any settlement that was going to be taken from this point. The other generals who took the other areas, Antigonus, Craterus, and Ptolemy, and a little bit Lysimachus, which we'll look at him a bit. There's a lot of people to talk about, so I'm going to try and keep this as brief as possible until we can come back and do a full series on the War of the Diadochi. But the other generals, and therefore Diadochi, didn't like Perdiccas. Perdiccas was the most situated to take total control of the empire, and yet he didn't want to do this through overtly good means. He wanted to put the child of Alexander IV in control and grant himself the title of regent of the empire, essentially making him the controller of everything for at least the next 18 years. While he was doing this, he engaged in heavy border disputes with some of the other Diadochi in Egypt and in Anatolia. So, he was not very well liked, although he was the most powerful. He was the most capable of inflicting violence, and he was willing to use deception to his own ends to gain the power that he so craved. Unfortunately, that's only 2 of the 3 strategies, and the first one can, and in this case was, more important. That of coalitions. So Craterus had returned to Macedon to become the leader, the satrap of that area, and Athens and several other cities immediately revolted, so he was locked down. Lysimachus returned to Thrace, and that area was actually still very wild. There was a lot of people there that didn't speak Greek and didn't particularly enjoy being under Greek leadership, so Lysimachus was very tied down in that regard. Another one of the great generals of Alexander was Antigonus the One-Eye. He had one eye because he was a very astute warrior and had taken a wound to one of his eyes, but continued to fight on, command his men, and be a staunch leader. He took Anatolia, and he immediately saw that Perdiccas's ambition was not that of restoring the empire or his proclaimed unity of the empire under the lineage of Alexander, but more to make himself great and to attempt to take over everything else. So, in addition to these players, we also have one more, Ptolemy I. Ptolemy I would eventually become Ptolemy I Soter, Soter meaning savior. He actually went into a little city called Rhodes off the coast of Anatolia and saved them from a massive siege by a gentleman named Demetrius, the Taker of Cities. So you could see why he would get the title Savior when defeating the man who was known specifically for taking cities. Anyways, Ptolemy was quite possibly the greatest of the Diadochi in the sense that his strategy and his end goal were the one that was actually brought to fruition. Ptolemy didn't think that the entire empire actually could be ruled by a single man. In fact, the way he saw it, the empire had never actually been ruled by a single man, and therefore it was a little silly to expect that this was just going to suddenly happen without a lot of bloodshed. Ptolemy wanted the empire broken up into several pieces, and he never overtly made this goal stated, but he was willing to work with the smaller parts of the empire to achieve that goal and to keep any of the larger members, such as Perdiccas, in check. So, Ptolemy I went down to Egypt and took that domain as his own. He actually started a new dynasty. And in the beginning, he wasn't necessarily putting down revolts or engaging in heavy fighting, but he was entrenching himself in the Egyptian culture. He was making himself pharaoh, doing everything that he could to blend himself and the culture of Egypt, which he now had to come to understand, to lead, and to meld himself into. As we spoke about previously, Egypt was actually very good at this, at assimilating foreigners into their own culture and making them more Egyptian than not. But Ptolemy was a very smart man. He possessed not only great measures of Metis, but also great measures of Bie. He had been one of the most successful generals under Alexander, which was how he came to have such great holdings. And after shoring up the defenses and his own popularity in Egypt, had the most independent and the hardest to invade of the three spheres of Asia, Europe, and Egypt that had been brought into the fold under Alexander. Now, something had to be done about Perdiccas. Nobody liked him, and he was underneath everyone's noses, taking bits of land, going to war, and doing just about anything that he could to engorge his own ego and to swell his own land holdings. The only thing was they needed a just action, and if you were to attack someone much larger, it would be hard to call in other potential allies when you were the aggressor to begin with. So, I mentioned that Alexander the Great's body was in Babylon. Perdiccas had attempted to send it to Macedon, to his old capital, but en route, Ptolemy had sent some spies, agents, whatever you want to call them, to intercept the body and to convince those who were carrying it to take it to Alexandria in Egypt, where he had built his greatest of temples. With the abduction, reappropriation of Alexander's body, Perdiccas was infuriated. He saw himself as the regent of the empire, and he saw this as a questioning of his iron will and his ability to dictate to the others. He decided to go to war with Ptolemy, and this was when Ptolemy called on Antigonus, who had had border disputes, and Craterus in Macedon, who had finally put down those rebellions, and even Lysimachus, who would come in a little bit later, to all gang up and form a grand coalition of Hellenistic states against the ambitions of Perdiccas. So, the stage has been set, and the decision, war, has been made. let's take a look at the two sides and try to condense them a bit because I don't want to have to say 6 names every time I talk about any sort of action. So we have two fundamentally opposed forces in the First War of the Diadochi, which really determined the course of Alexander's empire for the rest of its existence. On the one hand, we had the coalition of Ptolemy. This consisted of Ptolemy himself in Egypt, Craterus and later Cassander in Macedon, Lysimachus in Thrace, and Antigonus the One-Eye in Anatolia. On the other hand, we have Perdiccas, who controlled Asia, being Syria, Palestine, Babylon, Persia, Sogdiana, Parthia, Bactria. It was a massive chunk of the overall lands conquered by Alexander. And he did have one ally, Eumenes, who was in Cappadocia, which is a region of southern Anatolia. So the Great Perdiccas had his ambition set on being not only the regent for the young Alexander IV, but also the ruler of all of Alexander's empire. And none of the other Diadochi particularly liked him or saw him as a true successor to Alexander. As Alexander himself had said, to the best, to the greatest. And if Perdiccas was not this man, if he was not the greatest, if he did not possess arete, the excellence of both Metis and Bie, he would not succeed. And as it went, he did not. But let's take a closer look. Perdiccas certainly had his ability for violence and had previously been attempting to act with deception, but his lackluster coalition between himself and his large lands and his one ally would fall short in the fact that he would be fighting a war on two fronts, to the north towards Anatolia and Macedon, and to the south towards Egypt. Ptolemy's coalition had the stability and the wealth of the former areas that had been independent and that had been held by Alexander when he first began his conquests. So, under Ptolemy's coalition, they would soon also exploit their own deception, as in the rerouting of the body of Alexander, and their own violence. It began with the mobilization of all of the Asian armies towards Egypt, and Eumenes went north towards Craterus and Antigonus. Now, Eumenes was not the greatest of generals, and Craterus in fact was. So, Craterus led an army over towards this, and they had a battle, and unfortunately, Craterus's horse fell over on him. Something like that happened, and he died in the first battle, which shocked everyone. This was a massive boost to the ego of Perdiccas, who decided to march quickly south into Egypt with his massive army. Ptolemy, on the other hand, had a much smaller area. The main defense that he had was not man count or the morale of his soldiers. It was the geography of Egypt, which he would use to its fullest extent. Ptolemy made sure to keep the coalition held strong, sending ships through the eastern Mediterranean, which his Egyptian fleet kept mostly open and safe, and ensuring that after Craterus had died, his successor Cassander still had an open way, and Lysimachus and Antigonus still also had their military forces, and were pushing hard against Eumenes and Perdiccas' son, Demetrius, the taker of cities. So, Perdiccas' forces were split. At this point, he had to send a good amount north, but he kept the bulk of his army south, because if he could knock out Ptolemy in a clean sweep, he would have 2 of the 3 areas of Alexander's empire, and could bargain from there. Unfortunately for Perdiccas' great ego, he was not quite the Metis-minded man. He did not have tactical supremacy, and in his haste to execute his plans, he did not check the land or his ability to confront his enemy. The Egyptian fleets would keep the Asian fleets in check, so he had to come through the land route, down through Palestine, through Gaza, and into Egypt. Ptolemy held his forces strong on the west bank of the Great Nile River and would harry his opponent Perdiccas whenever he would try to make his crossings. At this point, the war in the north was basically at a stalemate. Antigonus, Lysimachus, and Craterus, and eventually Cassander, were keeping Eumenes and Demetrius in check, but there was no real victor on either side. So it came down to Ptolemy, the great leader, to decide the fate of the First Diadochi War and the fate of the Hellenistic world after that. As stated, Ptolemy's goal was not to become ruler or leader or emperor or anything like that. Ptolemy wanted the various areas to be broken down and to be under a sort of cultural hegemony towards the Hellenists, the Greeks of the time, and did not think that there was any way for any one man to rule such a vast empire with so many different cultures and ideas going around. So Ptolemy took his army and hid on the west side of the Nile River. Perdiccas finally met on the east side. He attempted several times in the area of the delta to cross the river, but Ptolemy's very focused army was able to harry his troops and to push them back each time. There were several crossings of the river, so Ptolemy could fall back every time that Perdiccas thought that he broke through and have a new front to attack his larger opponent on. This frustrated Perdiccas, who thought of himself as a great leader and as a great warrior, so he went further south and attempted to cross the Nile River, where it was one large area. This was a very foolish move, and Ptolemy set his trap and was ready to attack. Ptolemy broke up his forces into multiple smaller ones, and instead of gathering right where Perdiccas' army was, spread them thin along the river. He knew the current of the Nile could not be trusted, and any attempted crossing would leave his men in disparate places. Perdiccas attempted to send his men across the mighty Nile, and every time they would stray off course, break up before they could land on the west side, and would be murdered and surrounded by Ptolemy's own army. The deception and the strategic use of violence in this case showed that Ptolemy was the greater strategician. Yeah, he was the greater strategy developer. He had Metis, the ability to think quickly, but he wasn't willing to sacrifice his men unneededly or to allow his coalition to develop to meet his own selfish needs. Because of this, Ptolemy held his coalition strong. He could not be seen through when he was using deceptive means, and his violence was well placed against the army of Perdiccas. After several failed attempts at crossing the river, Perdiccas made camp, and he met with his lieutenants and his staff officers. Now, several of these men had been led by this Perdiccas because they believed that they would be rewarded in the way that Alexander rewarded his successors by giving them power, by giving them land, things like that. Perdiccas was a very selfish and cruel man, however, and when he called his staff officers, he was not willing to see his own failings. He wanted a plan to get across and to know why his men didn't have the valor, the Bie, to go take the much smaller force in Egypt. Ptolemy laid his final trap in deception, in meeting with several of the officers under Perdiccas, one of them being Seleucus, who would become Seleucus I Nigator, which means Seleucus I, victorious. Which we'll have to look at another time. I've already gone way over for this one, but Ptolemy's officers met with Perdiccas' officers and offered what Perdiccas would not. He would give all of them holdings. Seleucus himself would get Babylonia, a very rich province, if they could end the war. And so that is exactly what they did. Killed by his own officers, Perdiccas' force was stopped at the Nile. The battle was over, Eumenes up in Cappadocia was defeated, and Demetrius became entrenched in some of the smaller cities to fight with the other leaders in Macedonia for some time to come. This was the end of the First War of the Diadochi. But there would be 3 more. All that these would do, however, was solidify the lines that had been drawn in the sand, dividing up the empire of Alexander. So, Ptolemy I, through shrewd use of coalitions, deception, and planned violence, while also balancing the strategic thinking of Metis against the iron courage of Bie, managed to win out against a much stronger, much more capable opponent, and to achieve the goal which he had wanted. Now, the other Diadochi actually tried to make Ptolemy I the new regent of the empire, but Ptolemy refused, instead wanting to break up the areas that had been formerly under Perdiccas, and to distribute them to Antigonus, and to Seleucus, and a few others who had been loyal in the coalition and had fought hard against this old adversary. The lines were now drawn. The empire of Alexander would not be unified. It would not be one whole. It would be divided into 3 zones: Europe, Asia, and Egypt. And these 3 areas would hold and would progress and would flower under the Hellenistic environment and the Hellenistic culture until the very end. The very end in this case being the rise of a small backwater city far on the Italian peninsula called Rome. Thank you very much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed. This was a much longer series than I first intended. Usually I have multiple parts going over a long time, but I'm a Hellenophile, I think the word is. The ancient Greeks, the Hellenistic Greeks, the Byzantine Greeks, they're my absolute favorite. There's so much that you can learn from this area. As you'll notice, we went over a little bit of the Iliad, a little bit of the Odyssey, a little bit of Aristotle, and then the First War of the Diadochi. There's still so much to go over. There's still so much information. I really wish that I could have gone a little bit deeper, but I hope that you enjoy all the same. And that's it for now. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed, I hope that you leave a like, or if there's something that you didn't understand, you want to see more of, any sort of input whatsoever, feel free to leave a comment. I respond to just about all of them. If you want to see more content like this, make sure to subscribe so that you can see all the latest videos. And this is going to be a little bit longer of a set. It'll probably be about 3 episodes, so if you enjoy this, let me know. If there's anything else you want to see, let me know. But until next time, remember, Ave Imperator.